Well, welcome to Christ and Culture. This is Pastor Jeff Short for another episode of Christ and Culture. Glad to have you along for the discussion today. Today, we're going to be talking about the importance of Christians being discerning and thinking through the issues and not just jumping on the bandwagon and not just joining the crowd, the popular crowd, and saying, oh, everybody's saying this, so it must be so. We're living in crazy times. We're living in propaganda times. We can't trust the news. We can't trust the internet. We can't trust the sources that we normally would trust under normal times. We're living in a time of heavy propaganda, heavy messaging. And as Christians, we need to be discerning. We need to be thinking. We need to be using our minds. God gave us reasoning ability. Now, He says, don't lean on your own understanding, meaning don't use your thinking to contradict Him. See, a lot of people in our secular age, they like to use their mind, but to contradict God. Yeah, I remember the famous evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins in a number of his books. It's not just one book, but a number of his biological books. He's actually criticizing God for designing certain organs in the body the certain way, because he said if God had designed the eye, for example, in a better way, we would be able to see better. But see, He designed the eye wrong, and here any engineer worth his salt would have done it this way, and God did it this way. So that shows that God couldn't have been the designer, because He would have, if he were the designer of the eye, He would have been a dumb engineer. And he actually criticizes God and goes from that organ to different organs in the body and saying, this should have been designed this way. And this should have been designed this way. This is a better way to design it. So he criticizes God. That's arrogance. That's just hubris, as they used to say in the Greek society. Hubris, pride. God is doing what He wants to do, and He designed things the way He wants them to be designed. Now, there is the fall that occurred, and so we can't say that everything that we see in nature is the way it was originally, but God designed things in His way, in His wisdom, and it's wrong for man to come back and question. So we don't use our minds to contradict God. We don't use our minds to attack God and sit in judgment of God, but we're to be using our minds. The scripture says, let us reason together, saith the Lord. So we want to use and be critical thinkers in our minds when we see things happen in the world, because as Christians, we are witnessing to the truth of God. Now, one of the greatest glaring examples of Christians not using their minds and not using their critical facilities and not doing critical thinking and not being discerning is in the whole issue of George Floyd and racism. There is a narrative that is being promoted by organizations such as Black Lives Matter, the Democratic Party, liberalism, leftism, secular humanism, socialism, the radical re-engineering of society by tearing down the structures that exist now and rebuilding. And they are pushing the narrative that George Floyd died because of racism. And yet, the entire trial that went on with that police officer, he was not charged with racism. There is no evidence that was brought forth that he was a racist or that he acted under racial hatred in the way he handled George Floyd. There's no indication in the record, in the evidence, in the facts, that he wouldn't have done a similar thing to a white person or a brown person or a yellow person, Hispanic, Asian, Native American Indian, white, black. There is no evidence that this police officer treated George Floyd worse because he was black. And yet that is the narrative that we're hearing in the newspaper. All the mainstream media is repeating this. And all of the universities and colleges and the protests that come from students, they're all saying This is a racist cop. He did a racist hate crime on George Floyd. George Floyd is a symbol of racism in this country, and we're going to march and protest and riot and burn down cities, and we're going to make a big ruckus because this is racism. But the facts, the evidence, the data, to any reasonable, rational person will not come up with the conclusion that this was out of racism. This would fall under the category of excessive force, possibly, or police brutality, possibly, or improper treatment, possibly, but not racism. And yet, I ran across another Christian organization that used the death of George Floyd to talk about the evils of racism and how the church needs to speak out against racism and how there is racism in the church, and on and on and on, as if the death of George Floyd proved without a question that there is racism in the police department, and this is an example of it. No, it's not an example of it. It never was proved that it was an example of it. It was never in the court that it was of it. And yet everyone is talking about George Floyd died at the hands of a racist. That is not what we know, and that is not what the evidence supports. And yet Christian organizations, denominations, ministry leaders are all talking about racism because of George Floyd. The latest one that I ran across is a small Baptist denomination that used to be called the Baptist General Conference. Now they changed the name due to a marketing campaign. They have a new name for their denomination of Baptist churches, and it's called Converge. Yes, that's true. That is the name of their denomination, Converge. It sounds like some space age high-tech company. It sounds like some corporate high-technology company, Converge. But that's the name of a church organization. That's the name of the denomination of churches that used to be called Baptist General Conference. Now, when it was called Baptist General Conference, you actually learned something from the name of the church. You learned that, one, it was Baptist. And you understand all that means. That means that they baptize adults, believers, and they don't baptize infant babies. So you learn that they're Baptist. There are other things that Baptists believe. You learn that that's what they are. They're a Baptist denomination full of Baptist churches in the old name, Baptist General Conference. You also learn that they're a general conference. You learn that they believe in general atonement. There are particular Baptists, and they believe in particular atonement. They are more Calvinist in their belief. They believe that God saves the elect, and they believe that there are some people that are not elect, and that God does not save those. And that's the particular Baptist, but this is a Baptist General Conference, and the General Baptists don't believe the particular Baptist way of doctrine. And so you'll learn something else about Baptist General Conference. And then you learn something that they are a conference of churches, they are a convention of churches, that they are a family of churches, a body of churches, a convention. So it's Baptist General Conference, BGC. And that's what it was when I was part of it some 20 years ago or so. And when I was ministering at a Baptist General Conference, we shortened it, we called it BGC. And that was the acronym for the Baptist General Conference. Nothing wrong with the name. I don't think it turned anybody off. I don't think young people said, hey, let's not go to that church. It's got Baptist in the name. I don't think it really made a big difference. But the leaders at the time, the denominational president and some of the other pastors that were highly influential in the denomination, they believed that, it was so important that we market and, quote, brand ourselves correctly. So we're going to call ourselves Converge, because that's cool, and the young people will like it. And I really don't know if anybody came over the last 15 or 20 years to a BGC or Baptist General Conference church because they changed the name to Converge. I don't know if that made one shred of difference, but they thought it would, so that's why they changed the name. Well, after the death of George Floyd in 2020 at the hands of a policeman, Black Lives Matter started protesting, and the mainstream media started broadcasting that this was a racist act, and this proves that racism is alive and well, and black people are being killed by white people all in this country, and that there's systemic racism, and we have to stamp out all the structures of society, and we have to go from stem to stern and wipe out every vestige of not just racism, but we have to be anti-racist. In other words, we have to take action and be preemptive and go through every institution and anything that could be in any way a hint of racism we need to destroy. And so that's what's been happening for the last couple of years. But what is disappointing is that Christian churches and Christian pastors and Christian leaders, many of them, have bought in to the secular humanistic narrative that George Floyd is a symbol of racism in this country. And so the Baptist General Conference, after the death of George Floyd, the president of the Baptist General Conference made a video and said, the death of George Floyd shows us how bad racism is in the United States, and we as a church need to do better, and we've let this go long enough, and we need to address this terrible, critical issue of racism, and George Floyd is a symbol of racism, and on and on and on and on. He bought into the narrative of the mainstream media, hook, line, and sinker, without discernment. Instead of saying, well, all the mainstream media, ABC, CBS, NBC, MSNBC, PBS, NPR, everybody on the mainstream media, they're all talking about George Floyd and racism because obviously this policeman was a racist or else he wouldn't have killed George Floyd. And so that narrative has gone out. But let's look at the evidence. Let's look at the facts. Let's just not repeat what we hear. And let's not just believe everything we read in the newspaper or hear on the radio. Let's actually think through the issue and see what we can make sense of. And if you do that, if you look at the facts and look at the evidence and you listen to the testimony and you look at the eyewitnesses and you look at the video and you take everything into consideration, there is no way that you will come to the conclusion that George Floyd is a symbol of racism in this country, and that you cannot conclude by looking at the facts that this policeman killed George Floyd because he was black, and because he was a white supremacist, and because he was a white racist, and because he hated black people. You cannot conclude that from the evidence. So in order to push that narrative that the mainstream media is pushing and Black Lives Matter is protesting about and rioting and burning down and basically shaking down corporate America, and that's happened. Corporate America has given millions and millions of dollars to Black Lives Matter and has promoted the narrative that this is a systemically racist country, because if they don't, Black Lives Matter will protest their company and boycott their company and cause all kinds of trouble for them economically. And so it's easier to just go along and say, we believe that George Floyd died at the hands of a racist, and we have to address the systemic racist problem we have in this country, and the white privilege and the white supremacy, and on, the whole 9 yards. And that's easier to do for corporate America than to sit back and say, wait, this isn't proof. George Floyd's death is not proof of racism in this country because there's no proof that he died of a hate crime. No, that would get protests of Black Lives Matter, and that would get riots, and that would cause all kinds of trouble. So it's easier to just buy into the narrative. That same thinking that corporate America, the CEOs of and presidents of these leading corporations, the same thinking is what many Christian leaders followed. And that is, it's a lot easier to just go along and jump on the bandwagon and just talk about systemic racism and white supremacy, and we need to be anti-racist, and we need to have white guilt, and we need to do this, that, and the other. It's a lot easier to do that than to actually critically look at the facts and say, wait a minute, does George Floyd's death actually prove anything about racism? Because if you actually look at the facts and you actually look at the evidence, and you can even look at the trial and listen to the trial, George Floyd died. There's no question about that. Everyone agrees. But the question is, did he die because the officer was a racist? And there's no evidence for that. There was no racial slur made. There was no mention of race. There was no mention of skin color. There is no evidence that would say that this officer treated this man any different than he would have treated any other man in the same situation. So if you actually sit down and actually watch the trial of this police officer for the death of George Floyd, you will probably gain more information about the facts of the case than any other place to go. And yet, isn't it interesting that the lawyers that were prosecuting this police officer, they didn't charge him with racism. They didn't charge him with a hate crime. They charged him with murder because they believed that there was enough evidence to convict him on the basis of murder because he didn't have to treat George Floyd the way he did. And that is a possibility. And that is probably closer to the truth than anything else. This police officer did not need to take the actions he did. There are arguments that would conclude that he actually did need to take those actions because George Floyd was resisting, that George Floyd was a huge man, bigger than the officer. And so he needed to have some advantage over this man who was resisting arrest. And so he did what he was trained to do. There were officers trained in that kind of restraint, the knee on the neck restraint. And so this officer was resorting to some kind of training. Now, there's a question as to whether that training is really appropriate, and a lot of police departments are saying, no, that's not appropriate. And that's an argument that is made, that it's not appropriate. And as it turned out, he was convicted of the death of George Floyd and is sentenced to prison. And that outcome may well be totally correct. But we're not talking about the outcome of a murder trial. We're talking about the charge of racism. And we're talking about what sparked riots and protests and this whole big push to get white people to realize that they're racist scums and they need to basically dismantle all the systems and institutions of our society to remake them into the image of Black Lives Matter movement. And Christians are buying into that narrative without thinking it through. Now, the problem a lot of times with pastors and denominational leaders like the Baptist General Conference and megachurch pastors like, for example, Willow Creek Community Church and the new pastor there, the problem is that, and I understand this, they don't want to pick a fight with the very people they're hoping they can convert to Christianity. In other words, there are secular people who need Jesus Christ. And so if you start trying to be discerning about issues like racism, and you actually try to get to the truth of this whole issue, it may go against the popular, liberal, leftist, secular, humanistic narrative, and it may contradict the views of the people that you're trying to reach for your church. And so they might reason that it's better to just go along with what they believe, whether it's true or not. And I think this is the case with a lot of churches in this country. They don't want to alienate the mission field that they're seeking to bring into the church and bring to Jesus and disciple. The problem with that thinking is if you don't disciple them with the truth, if you don't attract them with the truth, what are you recruiting them with? Emotions? The promise of a loving community? Yes, Christianity does promise a loving community, but that's not the only thing, and that's not the main thing. The main thing, Jesus said that he was the way, the truth, and the life. You can't just throw out the truth and say, well, we'll make Jesus the way and the life, but we won't talk about truth because that divides people. That will alienate our target audience. See, in the case of Willow Creek Community Church, they have a lot of people out there in the western suburbs that are liberal, that are leftists, that have bought totally into the George Floyd, Black Lives Matter narrative about this systemic racism in this country. And the Willow Creek Community Church leaders may say, well, we don't want to have to fight that battle because I'm afraid we'll probably lose and we'll alienate people in the process. So why don't we just go along? Who's to say, maybe the policeman was a racist. Maybe he did have hate in his heart. Even though there's no evidence that he's a racist, even though that this is no evidence of a hate crime and that there was any racism involved by any of the officers, even though that maybe they were. And so why not just go along with the popular narrative, because we don't want to be unpopular with the field that we're trying to reach for Christ. So they reason, let's just go with the flow. The people think that it's a racist act, so yeah, it's a racist act. And let's preach against racism. Let's use it as an opportunity to preach against the sin of racism, which is not a bad idea. But don't say something that isn't racist is racist just to preach against racism. Use a concrete example. If you want to preach against racism, use what took place during the 60s that Martin Luther King fought against. If you're going to preach against racism, use the situation where black people were pushed to the back of the bus, or that they were discriminated against and had to use separate facilities. Use concrete examples of racism and preach against racism. But don't manufacture incidents of racism and in order to preach against the sin of racism. And don't make claims beyond the evidence. And don't follow the crowd, the Black Lives Matter mainstream media narrative, just to be popular with your mission field. And that's what a lot of Christians have done. I've seen it done in megachurches. I've seen it done with pastors of large churches. I'm thinking of a church in Novi, Michigan, Oak Point Church, where the pastor got up and said, we're going to preach a sermon series on racism for the next 5 weeks. This was after the death of George Floyd. I thought to myself, Well, why are you preaching a sermon series on racism when we don't even know that this is a racist act? And the pastor's logic was basically, well, everybody's saying it's racist. Black Lives Matter says it's racist. The mainstream media says it's racist. Whether it's racist or not, we don't know, but people think it is. So let's be against it. And in that sense, a lot of churches are virtue signaling, which is basically saying they're posturing themselves to say the right things and do the right things so that they look good. And that's a lot of virtue signaling in the Christian church. We see Christian leaders virtue signaling. We see church denominations like the Baptist General Conference, as an example, virtue signaling. We see these pastors, like this pastor of Oak Point Church, virtue signaling. They're just trying to look good. How about just being good? And how about being truthful? And how about teaching the truth? And letting God work through the truth, and stop trying to ride the trends and the movements and the narratives of our popular culture just to be approved. How about being honest? And as Christians, we need to think through things. There's a lot of false information and misinformation out there today, especially during the pandemic. Oh my goodness, we have been inundated by misinformation all the time. And as Christians, we have to have sound minds and sound thinking, and we need to be discerning. And we need to not believe everything we hear on the news and read in the newspapers and hear in the news magazines and on television, on the internet. We need to be discerning, and we need to think through things, and we need to question. When the so-called experts get on television and tell us all about the coronavirus, COVID-19, and we should do this and we should do that, and this works and this doesn't work, and we need to think about what they're saying, and we need to consider the evidence for what they're saying. And we need to do our own processing and think through these issues, and not just join the crowd, not just join the bandwagon, because as Christians, we're supposed to be the light of the world. We're supposed to be the leaders, not the followers. And so much has happened in the last couple years where Christian leaders have simply just followed the secular world and the secular narrative about COVID-19, about racism, you just name it. And they followed largely whatever the propagandists were putting out about all these things. And that's the lazy way. That's the lazy way. We don't want to build our churches on rumor. We don't want to build our church on misinformation. We don't want to build our church on narratives that are out there. We want to build our church on the truth of God. And we need to discern in our minds and think through things and come to conclusions based on wisdom and knowledge and accurate information, and not just because CNN said so. So that's a reminder for all of us to be critical in our thinking, question authority, think and pray and ask for God's wisdom, and don't be taken in by everything that you hear. Well, we'll see you back next week on another edition of Christ in Culture. God bless.